Good morning. Time now 8 a.m. On the May 10th, 2023 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Mori. I am a Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. Every the April and October, each of the regional chief economist offices publish the regional economic outlook and the deeper analysis on the key topics in respective regions. In our morning seminar programs, we are trying to cover all of those reports once being published. This morning, we are going to feature the Africa edition of the Regional Economic Update, which is titled as the Africa's Pulse, subtitled Leveraging the Resource Wealth During the Low Carbon Transition. We have the pleasure of having Cesar Calderon, who is a lead economist from the Office of the Chief Economist for Africa region. Cesar, good morning, good evening to you. Thanks for joining.
Good morning, Koichi. Thank you again for the invitation to present the main findings of the Africa's Pulse.
Great, thank you very much. So as usual, we'll be listening to Cesar presenting the main point of the Africa's Pulse, which is Africa's Regional Economic Update for next 40 minutes or so. Then I'll read the questions that we received from the viewers in advance and asking Cesar to respond. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please do so by sending your questions using the online form posted on the seminar announcement web page, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. So I'll read your question after Cesar's presentation, asking him to respond. So with that, I would like to ask Cesar to come in formally to start his presentation. Cesar, please come in. Thank you.
Thanks again. It's a pleasure to present the main findings of the regional update report to the Tokyo Morning Seminar Series. What we find, what is new for the region in this current issue is that unfortunately the economic growth remains challenging in the region. If you look at the evolution of GDP growth, after rebounding in 2021, after having a growth rate of 4.1 in 2021, growth is expected to decelerate to 3.6% in 2022. Now, these forecasts for 2022, or this expected growth for 2022, is more optimistic than the estimate that we had in the previous version of the report in October 2022. And this is attributed, this upgrade in the forecast in 2022 is attributed to some impetus in the global economy that was associated to a more resilient economy in the United States, thanks to some policies and also to lower inflation, also lower than expected gas prices in Europe, and the economic impetus at the end of 2020, the last quarter of 2024, of the reopening of China after unwinding all the COVID-19 restrictions. No? Having said that, despite the impetus that showed the global economy in the last quarter of 2022, growth is still expected to decelerate in the region. The growth rate for 2023 is estimated at 3.1%, and it's basically attributed, and we're going to see this in more detail throughout the presentation, is basically attributed to a uncertain global environment, to tightening global financial conditions, and other factors that are more specific to the region. And we're going to see them one by one as we go through this presentation. The other thing is that if you look at the growth per capita numbers, which are basically characterized by that black line, growth per capita is very low. if you look at the numbers in 2022 and 2023, we're talking about 1% per capita or 0.6% per capita. And in 24, 25, a little bit more than 1.2, 1.4%, which is a growth rate that is insufficient to try to reduce extreme poverty and bush prosperity in the region. Right now, if you see the two curves in the second graph, there is first of all, COVID derailed the path of poverty reduction, but at the same time, compared to other regions, the pace of poverty reduction is slow in sub-Saharan Africa. There are several reasons why it is slow. One of them being the less than stellar growth in GDP per capita. And the second is that at the same time, because of the nature of growth in the region, especially before 2014, growth translated very poorly into poverty reduction. So in other words, the growth elasticity of poverty reduction is low in sub-Saharan Africa as compared to other regions. And that might be due to the fact that growth is mainly explained, or growth was mainly explained during the period of high growth in the region by better performance of activities that are less intensive in labor. Next, we basically see a very similar behavior when we compare the Africa East and South, Eastern and Southern Africa, which is AFE, and Western and Central Africa, which is AFW. We observe also the drop in COVID, the deceleration in 2022 and 2023. The performance in terms of growth in the Western and Central region is slightly better than that of the Eastern and Southern, but it's still very insufficient when it comes to poverty reduction. Now, growth in the region, I may say, has also been dragged by the poor performance or the dismal performance of the largest economies in the region. For instance, in the Eastern and Southern Africa, you have the poor performance of South Africa, a country that is expected to grow by only 0.5% in 2023. And this is due to a severe energy crisis that is affecting not only manufacturing and mining, but it's also affecting services. And that's the energy crisis in South Africa is holding back economic activity. And the second, in the Western and Central, you have Nigeria. Nigeria that is expected to grow at 2.8% in 2023, slightly more than the growth of population, but still it has a very, very subdued performance of the oil sector that needs to improve, given that the oil sector still contributes a big chunk of economic activity and exports especially, and at the same time, production in Nigeria is still below the OPEC plus quota, and this could be attributed to many things: lack of investments, but also oil theft. However, Nigeria has tried to make some inroads in trying to prevent oil theft. Despite that, the gloomy scenario that I'm painting here, because as a result of the different shocks that have affected African countries over the last 3 years, there are still some signs of resilience. There are still some countries that have been able to grow, and have been able to grow in some cases above their long-term growth rates. So examples of resilience, for instance, are Kenya, a country that is growing around 5 or 5+%, thanks to an increased investor confidence due to the belief that the new government administration is being serious about fiscal reforms and strengthened manufacturing. Cote d'Ivoire is another example of a country that is showing certain resilience. In this case, the growth is expected to be between 6.5 and 6.7% for Cote d'Ivoire in 2023, and the economy has been basically supported by more dynamic private consumption and public investment. And finally, a third example, I mean, there are many, but the third example that I'm gonna say right now is DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that in 2022, it grew at more than 8% and is expected to continue growth between 7 and 8% over the next years, partly thanks to mining, particularly cobalt and copper, because of a capacity expansion in production in the country and also recovery in the demand for these minerals. So there are, in spite of the gloomy picture of the region in terms of economic growth, there are some signs of resilience in some countries. As I was saying before, I mean, there is an important deceleration of growth in 2023 in sub-Saharan Africa. What are the drivers of that? So we can think about at least 5. One is the sluggish and uncertain global growth. Second is global financial conditions that have tightened as a result of contractionary monetary policies and the reaction in financial markets. The third is, so these first two factors are more like external factors, external drivers. The third factor is the lack of investments in the region, what we observe over the last decade, which is a deceleration in the growth of investment, whether that investment is private, public, or FDI, and across countries. So it's broad-based also across countries. The fourth factor is inflation that is high, above central bank targets, and persistent in sub-Saharan Africa, with some characteristics that are different from other countries that we're observing. And the final driver is the high levels of public debt that are basically holding back economy. We're going to go one by one this presentation. As I said, the first factor is the sluggish and uncertain global growth. Okay, what we observe here is that, I mean, despite the fact that there were some resilience in the last quarter of 2022, we observed that in 2023 there is a drop in growth. I don't have the numbers with me, but if I'm correct, I would say that growth in advanced countries is expected to be around 2.6 in 2022 and a meager 0.7 in 2023. So there's going to be little support from the global economy for African countries. The other thing that we observe is that if we observe this correctly and you see the trajectory of these countries, there's a deceleration in 2023 and there's a very weak recovery in 2024. And recovery is such that countries are not going to be able to recover their pre-pandemic pace of growth. And a big chunk of that is attributed to the poor performance of emerging markets and developing economies that are getting farther and farther for this pre-COVID pace of growth. At the same time, this deceleration in economic activity is also translated into easing of commodity prices. And we can observe that, especially when we look at the decline in energy prices, mostly due to the decline in gas prices and also fertilizers. Okay, we're going to continue. Metals and minerals, on the other hand, have increased in the first months of the year. The second factor is tightened global financial conditions. As we said before, there was an increase in investment. You can observe that there was an increase in inflation in advanced countries, and that, but by the end of 2022, in the last months of 2022, the inflation appears to have peaked, and it has become has turned around and has started a downward trend. But that is, I think, more notable in the case of the euro area and somehow in the United States. However, it has been declining at a very slow pace. So there's some stickiness towards the decline in inflation. As a response to this increase in inflation in 2022, central banks in advanced economies reacted pretty rapidly and increased rates at an unprecedented speed. If you observe, for instance, in the second graph, let me see if I can point it out. Oops. You see this red line. This red line is the increase in policy rates, which basically captures the tightening of monetary policy in advanced countries that started the current tightening cycle that started in March 2022. And you see that this pace of rate increases is comparable to December 72, which is associated with the first oil shock, and then May of 1979, which is the big inflation crisis in the United States at the end of the 70s during the Carter administration, right? So again, this increase in interest rates is leading, what are the impact of these interest rate increases for emerging markets and for African economies? On the one hand, it may lead to outflows of capital. Those outflows of capital are going to weaken currencies, are going to expand sovereign spreads, and it's going to lead to a tightening of global financial conditions for these countries. The third factor is the lack of investments in sub-Saharan Africa. As I told you before, there is this fact that it's not only particular to Africa, but it's also worldwide. And I'm sure that when the previous global economic prospects, the one in January, was presented, you could see a picture of deceleration in growth, in investment growth throughout the world, throughout emerging markets. Here we zoom in on Africa. What's happening with investment growth in Africa, both in sub-Saharan Africa, in the two administrative regions of the bank, which are Eastern and Southern and Western and Central, and also for the region as a whole when it comes to private sector, public sector, and FDI, or foreign direct investment. What is it that we find? That indeed we can observe a deceleration in the growth of investment. You would see it in sub-Saharan Africa when you had in the period 2010 to 2013 investment growth at an annual rate that was almost 7%, and it was above the long-term average of investment growth. But after that period, you observe a deceleration in the growth rate of investment that is below this long-term value, and it's closer to 1.7, 1.8% per year, which is pretty low for investment growth. Same thing you would see it in Eastern and Western, in Eastern and Southern and Western Central. In the case of Eastern and Southern, you even observe a contraction in investment growth during the pandemic years. And in the case of, when we look at different types of investment, whether they are undertaken by the private sector, public sector, or FDI, we observe certain recovery in private investment during the COVID years, a protracted decline in public investment growth, which is critical for African countries, as public investment has been the engine of growth during the good years where African economies has been growing. And we also observe a contraction in FDI in the years after the 2014-15 plunge in commodity prices. So overall, we see that the lack of investments are not only holding back growth, are also holding back potential output, and may not allow countries in the region to meet the SDGs. No? The fourth factor is inflation. Inflation is not only persistent, but it's also high in sub-Saharan African countries. This graph basically shows in the orange bars the average inflation across countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, there is a wide heterogeneity in inflation rates across countries in the region. But what we observe is that in 2022 there's a huge increase in the rate of inflation, where the average inflation of the region reached 9.2%, which is a 14-year high. And of course, that has to be done. That has to be attributed to the fact that there was this pent-up demand that led to higher prices, and also you have, in the case of African countries, a lot of supply capacity constraints that led also to this increase in prices. Prices in Africa, they have increased in 2022 mostly because of higher food and fuel prices, and also because of weaker currencies. But we're going to see a little bit of that. The other thing that we can observe in 2022 is that the number of countries with high inflation, and by high inflation, we say countries with 2 or 3 digit inflation rates annually, has increased from 9 countries in 2021 to 21 countries in 2022. So it's a huge increase of countries with 2 digit or 2+ digit inflationary rates. In 2023, we expect that as a result of monetary policy tightening, a reduction in aggregate demand in these countries, and some easing in commodity prices, inflation will come down. However, inflation is coming down only to about 7.5%, if I remember correctly, which is still very high. And in 2024, will further reduce to 5%, which again, is still high, still above the central bank band targets or target bands in countries that have a nominal angle. The number of countries with 2+ digits, 2+ inflation, digit inflation rates is expected to decline from 21 in 2022 to 12. So there is some progress, but the fight against inflation is still on, is still alive in sub-Saharan Africa. As I said before, the inflation in the region is especially attributed to high food and fuel prices. And you have here the green balls basically tells us what is the food inflation, the annualized food inflation for every country. For every country that has monthly data in the region, there are more than 35 or 38, I think. And we can observe a big heterogeneity, a wide variety. But again, observe how many countries have inflation, food inflation of greater than 10%. The second factor is, as I said, currencies that are weaker, and these weaker currencies pretty much translate into higher inflation, given that food constitute a big part of food imports constitute a big part of the consumption basket, right? What distinguishes a little bit inflation in Africa with other regions or with the advanced economies is that whereas in some countries in the advanced world, food inflation has peaked, food inflation still hasn't peaked. It's still growing, and partly it might be attributed to, again, the fact that most of these products are imported, and the weaker currency contributes to the increase in their prices, and also high cost of inputs, in this case, fertilizers, and for instance, transport fuels. Okay. The fifth factor that explains the slowdown in 2023, or the slowdown that we're observing over the last 2 years after the rebound, after the post-COVID rebound, is the high levels of public debt. We observe that public debt in the region, at least in nominal terms, when we see it, for instance, in trillions of dollars, has more than tripled since 2010. And we observe 2 changes within the structure of debt in the region. One that is depicted in this slide, that basically shows that the share of domestic debt currency is increasing. You know, we see how that like like that green bar is increasing over time. And the second thing that we observe that is not depicted here is that there has been a change in the composition of creditors in external public debt. What we have now is less concessional debt, less concessional borrowing from African countries, and more borrowing from non-traditional official creditors, let's say China, India, Turkey, and also private creditors. In this context, we're talking about commercial banks and the issuance of international bonds, more particularly Eurobonds. As the increase in non-concessional lending and non-traditional creditors has increased, the debt service has also increased, and we observe that in the second graph, where we see how the cost of public debt service has increased for the region as a whole, as well as the two sub-regions. And for the region as a whole, by 2021, debt service represents around about 41% of government revenues, which is a very high burden. And this is the average. So there are countries in the region like let's say Ghana and Nigeria, where the debt service as a percentage of government revenues is even higher. Okay, as a percentage of exports, which is not depicted here, that debt services account for more than a quarter of the total value of exports, more specifically 28%. Yeah? Now, not only we have high levels of debt, but also high levels of vulnerability. Risk of debt distress is still an issue. It's still a big problem. We have 22 countries in the region that are either low-income countries, which is pretty much 22 countries is the length of that red bar in the first graph. 22 countries that are either at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. And as you see, since 2021, there is no either low-income country in the region that has low risk of debt distress. And all this has come also in an environment where, for instance, financial conditions have been deteriorating, especially in some financial institutions in Europe and the US with the fall of the Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic, Credit Suisse in Europe, and you observe that has translated at the end of this period in increased sovereign spreads. So that means that the current financial turmoil that the world is living is translating also in higher external borrowing costs for them. What has been the macroeconomic policy response? The macroeconomic policy response during this cycle has been contractional, pretty much. So in the case of monetary policy rates, we can observe there like the rapid increase in monetary policy rates, especially and the sizable increase, especially when it comes to, for instance, Ghana, when it comes to Nigeria, when it comes to Mozambique, right? Uganda, Zambia, and from the public sector standpoint, we have observed some consolidation, right? So, for instance, that green bar that you see positive is pretty much the amount of consolidation when it comes to the reduction of the primary balance of African governments when we compare 2023 with the year of the pandemic. Okay. So so far, this is the macroeconomic policy response. I mean, it has been effective in some countries and it has been less effective for a series of reasons. One of the policy recommendations that we have in the report, we basically argue that given that the global environment is going to remain challenging, African countries may not benefit as much as they used to do from the global external demand. So there is this urgency to try to balance growth across the different engines to try to support the recovery. So one of these dimensions is the regional engine, which is pretty much try to engage in intra-regional trade to try to grow. And the second one is African policymakers try to rely more increasingly on their domestic policy space so that they can somehow boost the domestic growth engine. But in order to do that, this domestic policy space should have at least three angles. The first one is macroeconomic stability needs to be restored. That implies reducing inflation rates and having a fiscal policy that is anchored in debt sustainability. The second is there is a need for more investments to foster inclusive growth, and that would require a series of structural reforms. African governments need to think about deepening structural reforms so they can be able to attract investments. And the third one is governments have to seize the opportunities available during the low carbon transition. We're going to try to go as fast as we can. I think we still have like 8 to 10 minutes to talk about these three different dimensions of the policy recommendations that are provided in the report. So when it comes to restoring macro stability, again, inflation is key. Inflation is key to curbing inflation is key because inflation right now is eroding purchasing power of African households, and in some cases, it's also a source of food insecurity. So monetary tightening should continue in African countries, but keeping an eye on the effects that it may have on economic activity and on jobs. The second is, in order to do that, African policymakers need to strengthen all the institutions that support an independent, a transparent, and an accountable monetary policy. Policy coordination is key also because there are several interventions during this past year from African governments that have weakened the monetary transmission. Give you a couple of examples. For instance, fiscal dominance, or what it's called in plain terms, the monetization of fiscal deficits. That is a problem that has plagued not only Ghana, but also Nigeria, that pretty much revert any effect of the increasing interest rates on inflation. And the second one is the presence of foreign exchange restrictions that may lead to parallel markets. And those parallel rates have feed into inflation. You have the case of, for instance, Nigeria, you have the case of Ethiopia, you can have the case of countries like South Sudan and Sudan, right? The fourth element in this first pillar is the fiscal policy anchored on debt sustainability. In case of debt sustainability of debt, there is the urgent need to accelerate debt reduction in the region and try to improve the mechanisms of debt restructuring. So there is here some role also for the international community to try to increase the uptake and also accelerate the debt treatments. And that will require, like doing more with the only framework that we have now to resolve debt on a multilateral level, I mean, among the many creditors, is the G20 sponsor common frame. But more needs to be done to increase uptake and to speed up the process. So, for instance, there should be a series there should be a clear timeline of the different stages of the process with due deadlines, with transparent rules and transparent procedures. The second thing is there should be mechanisms that encourage the earlier participation of private creditors and new bilateral lenders. Try to incorporate, go beyond low-income countries. There are middle-income countries that might enter into the distress, and there's already one there, which is Sri Lanka. And finally, we need to continue pushing for more transparency because that will facilitate debt reconciliation and debt restructuring. On the structural side, I'm going to focus on two things. One is bolster private investment and that can be done through a series of policies that enhance competition, whether it comes about removing structural barriers, creating more transparent and sound regulations, trade and FDI policies that can basically boost the access to critical intermediate inputs and participation and competition in global markets, and strengthening competitions, institutions that enforce competition, right? That's very important too. On the public investment efficiency, I'm going to skip that because this is something that we have been talking for a while, and I think it was also an issue that we discussed more in length in the previous presentation that we had of the Africa's Pulse in this same seminar. And the last is attracting FDI, where basically there should be key advances in what we call the 3 critical I's, no? Which are infrastructure, institutions, and incentives. In the case of infrastructure, transportation infrastructure needs to be upgraded. Provision of electricity needs to be expanded and needs to be more reliable. In the case of institutions, we need to strengthen investment and export promotional agencies and try to modernize customs procedures. Here, the role of digital technologies can be important. And incentives keep competitive exchange rates and transparent regulation and pro-export. Eliminate anti-bias of export policies sometimes in Africa. Okay, and now the final one, I'll try to rush into this. Unfortunately, I don't have the time. Is the low carbon transition presents an opportunity in Africa. Africa has a huge untapped resource potential that can provide a pathway to address existing fiscal challenges and also to support the recovery. And that can be done through a different set of policies. On the one hand, for instance, policies that capture the maximum value from extractive sectors that can provide some sort of fiscal stability and at the same time improve the management of commodities within the government. And the second one is a policy that policies that try to diversify assets, asset diversification policies that can allow countries to invest the revenues from these resources into other forms of reproducible capital, whether it's an educated workforce and for infrastructure, other physical capital, while at the same time trying to preserve the renewable natural capital. Okay, I think I still have, how many minutes do I have? I think 2 or 3.
Yes, please go ahead to complete your presentation. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Goichi. We know already that a majority of countries in the region are resource rich. And about, for instance, if you look at the latest Changing Wealth of Nations report, we know that at least 1/3 of the total wealth stock in Africa is natural capital, whether it's renewable when it comes to land, forest, water, or non-renewable sub-oil assets when it comes to extractives, whether it's energy in the form of oil, gas, and coal, and minerals. Okay. At the same time, that we see that most of the countries in the region are resource rich, there also have been a lot of recent discoveries in the region. We have seen between 2010 and 2020 a series of discoveries of oil and gas. For instance, Mozambique is one example. But at the same time, we observe that there has been lots of discoveries in some critical minerals that are going to be key inputs for clean technologies, such as cobalt and manganese. I'm going to try to go fast here, because one of the things that we are claiming in this report is that there are significant untapped opportunities on the fiscal side from natural resources. Rents, I mean, if I can give you an idea, resource rents from these extractive sectors in resource abundant countries in sub-Saharan Africa are about 9% of GDP. And the amount that the government takes from these rents is much, much lower, to the extent that these rents are 2.6 times higher than what the government takes. So that means pretty much that the country still has room to tax these industries, and by taxing these industries, they may somehow reduce the implicit production subsidies that we're giving these companies, and try to capture most of these resources so that it can provide some fiscal space. Now, taxation should be increased, but without deterring sufficient investment in these activities. At the same time, as I said before, there is the need to invest these resources in other forms of capital. The regional integration also presents an opportunity to the extent that it can unlock regional value chains. In this context, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement plays a very important role. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, if properly implemented, can present an unprecedented opportunity to try to develop mine to market value chains within the continent. And but that will require, for instance, as we said in the report, reducing and harmonizing mineral tariffs, and also have a regional approach to these value chains. Okay, so for instance, when we think about the value chains of these critical minerals, we can think from things about like backward linkages that has to do with the manufacturing of equipment, the extraction itself, and then, for instance, the processing mechanisms, right? So not every part of the value chain needs to be done by one single country. But that's where the AFCFTA could play a role, which is allow different countries in the region to participate in these value chains. So it's basically having a more regional approach to the production of these products up the value chain in critical minerals. And an example of interesting policies is the memorandum of understanding. The memorandum of understanding that has been signed on battery minerals between the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and the United States. That would allow these countries to unlock even more opportunities in terms of revenues and jobs, and try to combine their capacities and try to leverage technologies and know-how from the countries like the United States. Finally, and I'm going to try to go fast, is access to energy is a very important, it's a severe development obstacle in Sub-Saharan Africa. Right now, nearly half of the population in the region lacks access to electricity. Some scenarios by the International Energy Agency shows that within this decade, much of the added generation capacity is going to be led still by fossil fuels, and over the next decade, the addition is going to come more from renewables, and mostly primarily from solar photovoltaic, thanks to rapidly declining costs. Now, but still, the International Energy Agency claims that natural gas is going to play a transition role. A transition role is going to be a transition fuel while countries in the region build up their renewable energy capacity. Okay, and I think I'm gonna, given the time is of the essence, I think I'm gonna try to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cesar, for sharing the main findings of the latest edition of Africa's Pulse. Thank you very much. We received several questions. Thanks for sending your questions, Sasaki-san, as usual. Let me read the question that we received in advance. Cesar, you may want to, I mean, you have addressed some of the points already to the question, but you may want to repeat some of the points that you already mentioned. First question: would you please touch upon the current challenges and future perspectives in terms of food security in Africa? If macroeconomic and growth perspectives in the regions are not so optimistic for the time being, I'm worried about additional impact on the food security situation in the region.
Yeah.
Any comment, please?
Yeah. Should I just answer question by question, I guess, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, for instance, when it comes to the question, thanks so much for the questions. By the way, this is a very important question, the one on food security. In the previous edition of this report, we highlighted the problem of food security, the fact that there is urgent action from policymakers to tackle both short-term and long-term drivers of food insecurity. For instance, in this case, as I was saying during the presentation, tackling rising food and energy prices, addressing the effects of try to address the effects of climatic shocks, natural degradation, and also from the policy side, from the policies I mentioned, try to improve the effectiveness of public policies in agriculture. In the short term, what is needed to be done is, for instance, governments can use social protection programs if they can be expanded in order to protect the most vulnerable from food security crisis. Social safety nets are typically high impact and they're cost effective when it comes to provide rapid assistance to food insecure households. But at the same time, what you need to build is resilience so that these systems are self-financed and they can reach immediately the beneficiaries. The digital economy can play a role on that by the creation of digital registries of the probable beneficiaries of this income support, right? Another policy that can be done in the short term, especially in the current context where there is scarce public sector resources, is the need to improve the quality of government spending in agriculture. This is key. But in the current context, the previous report basically recommended repurposing public funding for agriculture and food systems to try to boost investments in high value activities, for instance, technology, research, soil and water management, market connectivity, and others. Irrigation is something that is also important. And the last thing that I can say about this question is try to think about how to reduce deficits of food in some countries is trade integration, including trade within Africa. That offers a unique opportunity to build resilience of food systems to international shocks. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Cesar. Second question. Several years ago, digital development was seen as one of the drivers for leapfrogging in the region, stimulating the foreign direct investment and creating jobs. How does the World Bank see digital development in Africa now, particularly for low carbon transition?
Yeah, I think the digital, I mean, one of the developments that accelerated during the pandemic was the adoption of digital technologies. Digital technologies, to some extent, mitigated the growth and employment impacts of the pandemic in some industries, in some activities. No, I think the bank still sees digital as a way to create jobs and create growth in Africa. However, there's a series of complementary policies that need to be also in place for digital to have an effect. I think if the audience wants to have an idea of what is the take in terms of the digital economy in Africa, the chief economist office has just recently published a report, a research report called Digital Africa. I can share with you the link. So if there's anyone interested, they can download the report. The big problem in Africa, the big problem that still exists in Africa is try to increase the uptake at the household level and enterprise. And the report basically summarizes a series of policy options that can be done to increase the uptake. For instance, you need to solve the problem of affordability. So in this context, you have policies like improving access to credit, market-induced price reduction of smartphones or data plans, no? Create apps and use digital technologies that are tailored to the context of the countries, right? Especially, for instance, when it comes to business advisory services, worker training programs. There's a lot of apps that are also helping farmers in the region when it comes to identifying tractors, early warning systems in terms of weather, and also in the case of pastoralism, what are the grazing, the pastures to grazing, and the location of water. So and that there is evidence that these apps have allowed the different groups to take their cattle and has reduced conflict, which is very important. But again, as I said before, you need also a series of complementary reforms, and this is where electricity is important, and education and skills are important, and a regulatory environment that supports competition and innovation. Okay? And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. Third question. Availability and access to electricity seems the core element of industrialization and growth anywhere. So the lack of the electricity in many African countries should be the most urgent priority for the government. For this purpose, large investment is required, but the government are struggling with the debt challenges and lack of financial capacity. What are the policy priorities for the government, and how can international society help them?
That's a very important question. And there are a series of approaches that governments can take. I'm going to mention some of them. My list is not going to be exhaustive, but I will try to see whether I can respond to some extent to the person that asked this question. The first involves public utilities. There's a lot of inefficiency in public utilities, and governments need to make these utilities financially viable. Many power providers in the region are cash-strapped or operate aging infrastructure, right? I mean, you have, for instance, the case of South Africa with these coal-fired plants that are aging and needs a lot of maintenance, to the extent that, you know, it's leading to massive load shedding in the country. These aging infrastructures cannot deliver reliable and affordable electricity to their customers. Yeah? That would be one priority. Improve the financial operation of these utilities, right? The second point would be to try to have also a regional approach, and this might be something that would benefit Western and Central African countries, where they can integrate their national utilities and grids to other systems in the region. Why am I saying this? Because in that part of the continent, you have abundance of affordable clean energy sources. Like, for instance, you have hydropower in Guinea, in Mali, in Cote d'Ivoire. You have high solar irradiation in the Sahel in general. But the problem is that the regional energy market is fragmented in the region. I think you need, in order for you to consolidate these markets and have countries benefiting from a regional power pool, you need to have efficient regional trade. A third priority would be to open the sector to private investments and private innovation. We already seen a little bit of that with solar energy and battery storage, right? And they might have a tremendous impact in trying to enable households in the region that are underserved or that don't have access to electricity. Off-grid solar system, mini-grid system have been reliable. There is an interesting There's an interesting regional report back from 2019 or 2020 that shows that off-grid solar systems and mini grids have been significant in trying to improve access to electricity services by African households. And the last priority, I would say, is there should be commitment from political leaders in trying to develop policies and regulations that can attract high quality investments in the sector. And I think I will stop here.
Thank you very much for your responses. Since we have several minutes, I have actually a question. A question about the slide number 11, high levels of public debt. On your second graph, rising debt service, you mentioned about the large share of non-traditional or non-concessional creditors. But if you look at this second graph, historically, Africa East has a higher number compared to Africa West, but in the last 2 years, Africa East is like going down, while Africa West is sort of quickly going up in the last 3 years. And then now, looking at the 2021 numbers, both East and West are kind of landing on the same level. Any stories behind this West rising up while East is sort of going down?
Yeah, I think you also sometimes observe spikes, and in this series, and sometimes the spikes have to do with Eurobond redemptions, right? I mean, as you know damn well, as you know very well, when advanced economies started undertaking these expansionary monetary policies as a result of the global financial crisis, there was an excess of liquidity. And that excess of liquidity in the hands of global investors that were searching for yields. And that led to lower standards in terms of who they would provide the credit, who they would provide borrowing. And things happened that we've never seen before, like a low-income country going to the market and issuing a Eurobond, right? Now, the problem is the following. The problem is that there are several things that are leading to this increase that you observe over time in debt. One, on the debt service. One has to do with the fact that now you're engaging with other creditors that give you a more expensive credit, right? For instance, when it comes to low-income countries, you compare like a concessional loan, a very low interest rate, and for 30, 40 years. And you compare that to, for instance, a Eurobond that is a 10 or 20-year Eurobond where you have to pay an interest rate above 5.5%. So it makes a difference, right? In the case of some non-traditional creditors, we don't have all the information of the terms and conditions of these loans, but there is some research that is being undertaken by academics, including Carmen Reinhardt, that shows that some of these loans coming from non-traditional creditors also come at a higher interest rate. So not only you have the issue of having higher interest rates, but also more debt in foreign currency, which basically leads an increase in currency risks. And as countries have also depreciated their currencies, you also see this increase in the debt service, right? So I would say, right at this point, is currency risks, interest rate risks, and the lower maturity that not only can generate these spikes, but also it can generate refinancing risks.
Thank you very much, Cesar, for responding to all the questions that we received, and also your presentation summarizing the main findings of the Africa's Pulse latest edition. We had a pleasure of having Cesar Calderon, the lead economist from the Office of the Chief Economist for Africa region of the World Bank this morning. Thank you very much, Cesar.
Thank you so much, Koichi.
Great, thank you. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. In Japan Standard Time, we are going to have another round of morning seminar, this time featuring the latest edition of the Commodity Market Outlook, which was released in the end of April. That's tomorrow, 8 a.m., in Japan Standard Time. And also, in 2019, when TCAT 7 was happening in Yokohama, we organized the Africa photo exhibit in Yokohama and Tokyo to show some of the very interesting photos taken by our colleague Dorothy Werner and the Japanese jazz legend Sadao Watanabe. In fact, this month in May, at the JICA Hokkaido, which is in Sapporo, the shorter version of the same photo exhibit, this time only featuring Dorothy Werner's photos, are now exhibited at the JICA Hokkaido. So if you happen to be in Sapporo area this month, please visit JICA Hokkaido to take a look at the photos taken by Dorothy Werner. And in fact, Monday next week at the 7 p.m. In Japan Standard Time, Dorothy is going to discuss her photos currently shown at the JICA Hokkaido, and then sharing her own experiences in Africa and taking those fantastic photos. So please join that talk session also. With that, once again, thank you very much for joining the seminar. I'll see you tomorrow morning and also Monday next week. Thank you very much.